The first thing to say is nobody, I think, is in any doubt about the importance of adverse child experiences and their long-term consequences. There was a time when we still had to convince people that they were important, but certainly the fact that there's action in Scotland, in Wales, elsewhere on adverse child experiences, the scientific question of are they important for long-term outcomes, in one sense has been settled. They are important, and I didn't hear debate about that. In a way, the scientific and practical questions of what to do is open and very important and unsettled. I was asked, what's the appropriate entry point? Where should we be intervening? And my thought about this, and I've been thinking about it, of course, in relation to social determinants of health more generally, is perhaps to think of it at maybe 3 different levels. The first is, I started the day by pointing out life expectancy in Scotland is going down. And in England, it's flat. And in Northern Ireland, it's going down. And in Wales, it's going down. Now, I've been arguing for a long time that the health of a society tells us something fundamental about the nature of the society. Not that life expectancy is the best measure, and it's not that life expectancy per se is so important, but it's a good indicator of the health of a society. So the fact that life expectancy is stalling or going down, the fact that inequalities are going up, so health, certainly the English data, which I know better, health's continuing to improve in the more affluent areas, and it's going down in the more deprived areas. So the gap's getting bigger. So that tells us that we need to be doing something fundamental at the societal level, I think. Thinking about Glasgow, I think you can't simply think, how can we reduce the toll of adverse child experiences and health inequalities without thinking about the decline of industrial employment in Glasgow and what's there to replace it. If people had stable jobs in heavy industry, shipbuilding and the like, and all that's available now is the gig economy, how does one deal with these structural factors? It is structural violence in a way, violence on communities and on families and individuals. And we can't deal with the other levels of entry without thinking about the future of our society. And we all have to be thinking about that. And it relates to employment. I mean, for some reason, I had it on my iPad and it came up looking at me. John Maynard Keynes' Economic Prospects for Our Grandchildren, which I think he first penned it in the 1930s, republished in the 1950s. And he was thinking about the economic prospects for our grandchildren when we only had to work 5 hours a day. I think being Keynes, he imagined we'd be performing in opera for the rest of the day, or I don't quite know what he imagined we'd all be doing. But the fact is, he was thinking about a future where having to work for 8 or 10 hours a day, maybe it was 12 or 15 hours a day in the 1930s, was not what was necessary to lead a life. He was inviting us to think what the structure of society should look like. And those of us who have busy day jobs trying to deal with the consequences of these long-term trends may say, leave me alone, I'm focusing on my day job. Well, yeah, but we ought to be contributing to that debate. And it's important. I mean, when I was asked the question, what should we do now? I said, stop Brexit. That's the first thing to do. Stop Brexit and just then we've got a bit of space to think about other things. The second level of intervention is what can government do on social and economic policies, so not thinking about the future of society and the future of employment and societies. I had the pleasure of talking to a group of master's students at the end of the morning session, and the question that they raised was, isn't a lot of the focus on ACEs rather downstream, looking at individuals and families without looking at the structural drivers of ACEs? I did remind them that most of my presentation this morning was on the structural drivers, on poverty and housing and the like. And they said, but is it possible to do anything about poverty? And my response, and I hasten to add, this is not a party political response, is looking at the evidence, is the new Labour government, much maligned by the current Labour leadership, took 500,000 children out of poverty as a result of government policy. It was government policy to reduce child poverty. So I'm not making a speech in favour of Gordon Brown or Tony Blair or whatever. I'm making a speech in favour of policies that reduce child poverty. And it's possible. Because Brexit's hijacked the whole agenda, we're not even talking about those things. And because austerity hijacked the agenda, we're not talking about those things. And I showed you a slide about the rise in child poverty. And one of the encouraging things for me about today is the thing that has given me and continues to give me sleepless nights since I began the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health is the question, why should ministers of education take health inequality seriously? Why should ministers of environment take health inequality seriously? Why should ministers of social protection take health inequality seriously? And I have sleepless nights about that. I have ministers of education say to me, it's not my problem. Oh, you want me to have kids run around the park once a week? That'll solve health inequalities. We'll give kids T-shirts if they run around the park. That's not quite what I have in mind. But what we heard today on ACEs, the reason those of us in the health field are concerned about ACEs is because of the adverse impact on health. But you have ministers from different departments who are concerned about childhood, because it relates to education, it relates to crime, it relates to all sorts of things. So what you get is cross-government action, and it doesn't necessarily have health as the outcome. Health will be the outcome, health inequalities will be the outcome, but the motivation for action, it might just be flourishing childhood, less crime, or whatever. So I think the work on ACEs is a good example of cross-government action. And that's vitally important. So we need to be thinking about the longer-term future of society. We need to be thinking about cross-government action. And here, let me put in a plug for Proportionate Universalism. One or two of you know that I created this unfortunate neologism. I will not go down in history for this wonderful new idea I created, Proportionate Universalism. But the whole idea was, if you've got in the deprived parts of Glasgow real pockets of deep-seated long-term disadvantage, that needs special effort. But not to continue to label those people as deprived and disadvantaged and somehow they're different and we'll do something for them. But we want to bring them into society as a whole. And given the gradient, you can't focus only on the bottom. What about people who are above the very bottom but are still below the middle? We want to include them too. What about people in the middle who are not doing as well as the top? And we know adverse child experiences follow the gradient. So proportionate approaches and proportionate universalism, universalist approaches and proportionate universalism says we want universalist approaches with effort proportionate to need. And then the third point of entry is community, local practitioners, working with families, working with individuals in the kind of way that you pointed out, with empathy, emotion, and the like. I've got through the whole day today without talking about the Self-Employed Women's Association in India. But there in India, SEVA, the Self-Employed Women's Association in Ahmedabad in the state of Gujarat, is dealing, if you think there's poverty in the west of Glasgow, think about the poverty in Ahmedabad in Gujarat. Think about these women who are really at the bottom of Indian society. And the Self-Employed Women's Association is dealing with their issues. Housing, better employment conditions, healthcare, childcare. The first time I visited SEVA in 2005, and I saw the childcare, and it was great that these children were not sitting on the street by their mothers who were selling vegetables and that they were in a room with carers. But I said to my colleague, one of the conveners of SEVA, it's all right. I mean, it's good that you're doing this, but it's not terrific. I mean, there were 35 kids in a small room with a couple of carers. It just didn't look terrific. I went back 10 years later, and they took me to a child facility, early child development. It was lovely, absolutely gorgeous. You know, lots of activities and beautiful colours and kids doing things and, committed carers and, teaching early child development, early skills. It was great. So there's grinding poverty of the kind that we've never seen in the United Kingdom. And I don't think they're doing a bad thing by the fact that they're not dealing with the fundamental drivers of the poverty. They're dealing with how can we improve the outlook. And some of the interviews that we did with these women saying, my daughter is the first ever in our family history to go to university. Wow. That's encouraging. So where do we need action? We need to be thinking about the future of society. We need to be thinking about the structural drivers of poverty and inequality. And we need to be right there at the front line, working with communities, with families, and with individuals. And I found the discussion today wonderful. Committed people trying to make a difference. And what did the minister say? That's the only thing that ever has. Thank you.